Good morning, everyone. If you enter this important session today, please feel free to use the chat to introduce yourself. But on behalf of WBC and Linkage, it is our honor and our privilege to learn and to act. So to thank you, Jennifer, and to Ivy and to Becky, this will be a very meaningful call, and we welcome your comments. Again, please join us and use the chat to introduce yourself. I'm Edie Fraser, CEO of the Women's Business Collaborative, and what a joy to have Linkage and what it does to propel women in and up the system to be our partner in this call today with two great talent culture leaders. Hello from across the country and the world, and please use the chat to introduce yourself and for comments. This is a really critical conversation of learnings that we all cherish. Good morning, everyone. Please use the chat to introduce yourselves, and we will start in 1 minute. Well, an official hello to all of you on behalf of this important session between Linkage and WBC. And first, let's think about the good news. It's Women's History Month as we kick off today, and how important that this session occurs and that thousands and thousands of corporate sessions, nonprofits, and others will stop and reflect what we need to do to recruit, retain, support not only women at work, but in their personal lives. So WBC is grateful to our nearly 70 organization partners and all our champions and leaders. Yes, we are going to ring the closing bell on Friday at the New York Stock Exchange for all of us women to really push economic advancement of equal position, pay, and power. Let us also stop, as we've been talking about what so many of us are feeling universally about the courage of the Ukrainian people and their leadership and their loved ones, and for staffs that the companies still have in Russia, and the care that we feel with them being so courageous and bold, but so sad for the nation and the world as we really seek peace and prosperity. So now let us think about today and the important work that Linkage is doing to assess with data and with examples, real leadership. And with that, two amazing officers of culture, human resources, talent, and learning and development. Ivy Kasenga, who is the Chief Culture and Talent Officer at Chubb. And Ivy, will stop for a minute and let you introduce yourself. But with that, let us reflect that you report to the CEO and that you have a listener in the CEO and your organization as you take some of the issues that we'll discuss today and work through that. And we look at what we've seen in the word diversity. 25 years ago, when we started with diversity officers, they were diversity officers. Then they became DE with the equity added to it. And then they became with I to be inclusion. And now it's about engagement. So we've seen a transformation propelling us all. So Ivy, you go first with an introduction, and then we're going to introduce Becky Compton.
Thank you so much, Edie. So good morning, good afternoon to all our attendees. Thank you so much for joining us. My name, as Edie indicated, is Ivy Kasenga. I am the Chief Culture Officer for Chubb. For our listening audience, if you don't know what Chubb is, we are the largest property and casualty insurance provider. We operate in 54 countries globally, and we have about 31,000 colleagues. I think I saw somebody from Chubb joining, so thank you so much for the sole Chubb attendee supporting me. Handing it back to you, Edie or Becky.
All right, and so with Becky Compton, you have had a tremendous career throughout HR, and you talk about, with Constellation Brands, intention and purpose. Would you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Edie. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. And thanks to all my colleagues from Constellation. I appreciate the chats coming in. I'm Becky Compton. I'm Senior Director of Talent Development with Constellation Brands. Constellation is a leading producer and marketer of beer, wine, and spirits. Some of our iconic and well-recognized brands that we're very proud of include the Corona brand family, Modelo Especial, and Pacifico in our beer portfolio, and brands such as Robert Mondavi, Naomi, Kim Crawford, and High West Whiskey in our premium wine and spirits portfolio. And I'm excited to be here today.
And so should we all say to Jennifer McCullen, thank you. Jennifer, as you lead Linkage, and we think about linkage and the whole idea of collaboration and support as that logo has significance. And as you talk about the Great Resignation, what are the tools and techniques that you will present as you look for women to really propel one another and call on men to support women and their leadership? Jennifer McCullen.
Edie, thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here today. I am the CEO of Linkage. Linkage, for those of you who don't know, is a 34-year-old leadership development firm whose mission is to change the face of leadership. It was a very easy decision for Linkage to become a resource partner to the Women Business Collaborative because our missions are so incredibly aligned. The way we execute our mission in the world is by focusing on leadership equity and leadership effectiveness. And one of the reasons that I invited Ivy and Becky today is Linkage has been working with both organizations that are so incredibly impressive in their ongoing efforts and commitment to advance, to retain, to engage, and to promote their women leaders. So it's no more fitting than today, on March 1st, the first day of Women's History Month, to bring to you a couple things. We're going to start at the macro level. What are we seeing in terms of the state of women in the workforce? Then we're going to hone in a little bit more deeply and look at some of the significant data that Linkage has been surfacing across the last several years that we see as leading indicators, cause for concern, some cause for celebration, and we're going to bring that to life through the stories and the incredible impact that Ivy and Becky will be talking us through today. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I will share the screen and ask you for a moment to reflect yourself. No matter where you sit in the world, my guess is most of us today at this time are probably in the United States. However, wherever you sit, your reality will be a variation of what you see here today on this screen. And it's been updated just in the last week or two with this war in the Ukraine. So when we look at what all of us have been experiencing, the ups and the downs, the chaos of what started as the virus way far away in Asia, and then very quickly across the course of 2020, completely upended our lives, exacerbated by the murder of George Floyd, the social unrest, the political division when it came to our election, and how we started to track the impact on all of us, but very specifically the impact of women. More net jobs lost for women than men, more burnout for women than men, the disproportionate burden at the office and with spouses, families, children on women than men, and especially women of color, I want to add as well. And just as we thought about a year ago as the vaccines were rolling out that things were getting better, we had the AAP I hate, the Great Resignation began, the Delta variant emerged, followed then by the Omicron variant, and now the war in the Ukraine. So when we get a little bit deeper and say, well, what is actually happening here? This data surfaced late last year that the employment rate for women is the lowest it's been in the last 30 years. Women are still behind in terms of net jobs lost. When we measure the burnout rate of women, it is double that of men. So at last measured late last year, it was 42% in 2021 versus 35% in 2020. And so in some ways, it's not really a surprise that women are choosing to reimagine. We can call it the Great Resignation, the Great Awakening, the Great Reimagination, but to reimagine their lives. And what does it look like to be a working woman today? And many are choosing to downshift or to leave the workforce altogether. Now, the WBC has been tracking this with a lot of the business partners. And I was really encouraged late last year when I watched Edie unveil the data about women in the boardroom and women in the CEO role. And I do want to say we are making a lot of progress, especially at the board level, a little bit of progress at the CEO level, but there's still so much work to be done. The numbers have not changed significantly in terms of women in the C-suite. It's about 20%, women in senior leadership positions, 25%, less than 40% of early manager positions. And importantly, women of color are losing even more ground at every step in the pipeline. So while we've made some progress, we do want to acknowledge the macro environment that we're working in. And I'm going to stop sharing for a moment and turn to Ivy first and then Becky and ask you, how are you seeing this come to life, specifically these macro environmental factors at your organizations? Ivy.
So thank you, Jennifer, for that sort of bigger macro picture. And I would say, I think this would be a consistent landscape for any business, and Chubb is no different. We're not immune to any of the headwinds that our businesses experience, especially when you're trading as globally as Chubb is, right? So the ongoing global pandemic, it remains an issue in terms of really making sure we have a high focus on not only employee well-being and safety, but frankly, the implications to the workforce around that, the social awareness of issues around race and racism and everything that goes along with that. And then frankly, I think all of us are facing real tough challenges dealing with the lopsided nature of the labor market. I mean, I think there's some people who are arguing that the labor market is an employee's market more than it's an employer's market. And I think I can shape up some of those experiences from a Chubb perspective. So when I look at Chubb data, our workforce data indicates we actually a very healthy pipeline from the entry level. We actually have slightly more women represented in our pipeline than we do men. But I think like all financial organizations, it's a thinning pipeline to the top. And so when I look at Chubb demographics, I have probably about 25% senior level officers represented at that more senior level. And clearly, when you have departures, Jennifer, you know your pipeline suffers, because the more limited or imbalanced your pipeline is, the more the departure and attrition rate really does matter. I do see a trend around early career professionals, so more early career professionals leaving for opportunities, and that could be that they're less vested, frankly, in the organization than people who maybe have longer tenure in the organization. But I think overridingly, we can say that the global pandemic and the other squeezes that take on in the microenvironment is making all our workforce or all our employees look at their work life a little bit differently. And whatever research you look at, there's really this very discernible shift to quality of work. So it's not just what am I doing, but how do I feel about what I'm doing? And what sort of rethinking do I need to undertake about that? And that's why we sort of also are paying very strong attention to the employee experience. That is work under my vein. The experience of women at Chubb, that is very much under my vein. And these, again, are leadership issues for any business. Yeah, so that's what I would share from the Chubb perspective.
Thank you for sharing that, Ivy. I'm going to turn it over to Becky, but I remember when we were preparing for this, a quote that stuck with me was, "When I lose a senior woman in the pipeline, I want to hide and cry." And I think we all feel that way, given that oftentimes our pipelines aren't as robust as we'd like them to be at the top. But the thing you brought that was unique, I think, was that we're also seeing early career women leaving in higher numbers as well. And so, Becky, I'm going to turn it to you and say, the same thing. What are you seeing at Constellation, and is it anything different than what we've talked about so far?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And so I would say everything that Ivy shared resonates for Constellation as well, particularly when we look at representation by level. In our early career levels, we see pretty equal representation between men and women, but that does thin, right, as we go up. So that's something we're working on internally. I think compared to the macro trends that you presented, Jennifer, our data is telling us a little bit of a different story internally that we're fortunate for. Throughout the pandemic, we've been surveying our population to check in on well-being, engagement. We're consistently seeing high levels of engagement and commitment to the organization, folks feeling like the company's doing what we need to do to support our employees, both in our men and our women. Where we see some divergence in that is similar to what you just shared, Jennifer. Certainly our women are reporting higher levels of stress comparative to their male counterparts, and especially into the pandemic, as well as challenges feeling equipped to balance the demands at home and the demands right at work. So we do see some differences in our data between our male respondents and our female respondents. From an attrition perspective, we're actually seeing less attrition than we did pre-pandemic, which is great. Again, at the macro Constellation level. That said, as Ivy was saying, when you lose someone senior, especially if there isn't a deep pipeline behind them, it is very felt and bittersweet. So when we lose a senior level woman in those very visible resignations, it is felt deeply. And typically it's because they are going to, it might be in our industry, out of our industry, a really fabulous opportunity. So it's celebratory for them personally, but it's hard to see them go. And I think it's great. I call them mirror moments for our organization, that we can't be complacent in our talent systems. We have to make sure that we're not only providing the right development paths, but the right paths to advancement and creating those opportunities internally so we can retain talent across the board.
Well, thank you both for diving deeply into the data and what you're seeing at your organizations. I want to shift to actually show you what we have been tracking for the last 5 years and what we're seeing that's pretty alarming when we look again across hundreds of organizations and thousands of women. At Linkage, we've been tracking the perception of women toward their organizations. And like I said, we have nearly 10,000 women, I think, over the last 6 years. And it's across industries and it's globally. The database is largely companies based in the US with global populations. And we specifically look at these 4 levers. And we know that these 4 levers are really critical to attract and retain and engage women leaders. The first is around the culture. Do your women feel valued? Do they feel respected? Do they feel like their uniqueness is honored and leveraged? Do they feel like they belong? The second is the talent systems. Do they feel equitable? When you look at things like access to stretch assignments or sponsorship, or things like the talent acquisition process, or opportunities to put your name in the hat for very visible, more senior roles, the high potential pipeline. The third is around executive action. We call this action and commitment. So are your executives visible and active in their efforts to advance and retain women leaders? And then the fourth one is leadership development for women. We know that all leaders need to be developed. We also know that women face unique challenges, and are we supporting very specifically the unique challenges of women and offering them access to things like coaching, mentoring, and sponsoring to support their development and ascension. So here, this is new. We haven't actually published this yet because we've been diving into the latest tranche of the data set that we gathered was through our Women in Leadership Institute, which we run every year. And we had 2,600 women there in November. And so we've been diving deeply into that data to see what has changed. In addition to measuring the perception of these 4 levers, we also measure 4 additional things: organizational values, fit, organizational engagement, commitment, and NPS, the Net Promoter Score. And this is really shocking. So when I turn the page, I want you to hone in on the colors that you're seeing first here on the left-hand side. This shocked us. This is data across the last 5 years. And you can see green, 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 red, all the way down the 2021 column. And basically, that is the first signal of a very alarming trend that we have never seen before since we've been tracking this data. So for the very first time, every single indicator was going down. And when you look at the right-hand side there, the Net Promoter Scores, so this is the women answering the question, would you recommend this company as a great place for women to work? For, again, the first time in the last 5 years, the number is now starting to go down. So this starts to explain this kind of great resignation and what were these leading indicators now coming into reality. We didn't see that in 2020. I think by and large, the workforce was in a little bit of shock and just happy that we were trying to maintain work while we were doing everything else. But now we're starting to see, as people emerge, this trend. So I want to go back again, and I'll start with Ivy. Based on what we're seeing, again, across industries and thousands of women, are you seeing similar trends in your organization?
So I think, Jennifer, you know that we are new to this work. So I think, let me give a little bit of a backdrop. You know, like most organizations, CHAP has had a very long-standing commitment to gender representation and gender balance. But I think that the point that you made very eloquently, Jennifer, is we pretty much have been focused on lagging indicators. So we do look at our metrics from a hiring perspective. We look at slates, we look at promotional rates, we look at attrition, we look at pay parity. So a lot of the things that you would expect to kind of keep a very healthy analysis of what you're looking at and what you're tracking. And the trend for CHUB year after year is really progress, but it's very modest progress, but at least it's progress in the right direction. I think the piece that you're pointing out is really looking at the leading indicators, and that's been a very new undertaking for us at CHUB. And as culture officer, I do think it does bear to people choose CHUB if they are convinced that financially the company is performing very well. But I think most of us choose an organization also because you're convinced you can thrive and grow at that organization. But who better to tell you about your chances of thriving and growing than the people who exist in that same organization? So paying attention to the experiences of women, I think, is actually very key, because if women are thriving and advancing and growing at Chubb, I think it nods to the pipeline, but it also nods to prospects. So we undertook a piece of work with you, Jennifer, where we're really looking at those leading indicators. We invited all our senior women, so we chose all our senior officers to really undertake that particular assessment. And really where we fell out is very indicative of some of the areas that we need to focus on. So culture was really rated as relatively higher than all the other aspects. But clearly our senior women are nodding to us, very clearly calling out the need for more executive actions from us as an organization, the need for our talent management systems to really be more transparent. So there was a real call out on transparency. And I think, honestly, some of the issues that fall disproportionately to women around, caregiving for their families and others in their lives. So do we have benefits, frankly, that are contemporized so that women can really feel, or working parents can really feel like they don't have to make these choices that are almost counter career for them? So again, just getting that baseline, I think, was a very, very helpful and healthy process for us. And then over time, hopefully we can use it as a way to benchmark our results every time we participate in that process.
So to hold that thought for a moment, because I'm going to come back to you and talk about what are you thinking about and planning now as a result of gathering that data. But one thing that I appreciate so much about what Ivy and her team at Chubb did with the top 125 women in the organization was that listening. So it started out as a kind of discussion, and then it moved into more formal measurement. And based on that more formal measurement, now it's become prioritization and strategy. And it's just been it's been a real pleasure to watch that kind of discipline process that you went through just, over the course of the last couple of months. So now I'm actually going to turn it to Becky. I'm going to go and share the screen, because I think this is the counterpoint to what happens in an organization when you are tracking these leading indicators year over year over year. So Becky, I'm not going to spoil your thunder, but I do want to just share the slides here around just look at the colors for a moment. And then I'm going to have Becky tell the story of how it started from 2017 to 2022, because we do find that when organizations are paying attention, they're listening, they're gathering data, they're prioritizing, they're strategizing, they actually do see very clear evidence in their numbers. So Becky, why don't I turn it over to you and you can tell us the story.
Sure. Thanks, Jennifer. Yeah, we're very pleased with these numbers and proud of them. And I'm pleased that they reflect the purposeful investments we've been making to develop and advance women at Constellation over the last 5 or 6 years. We began our partnership with Linkage about 5 years ago when we evolved and sort of transitioned our women's leadership development program. And we sent, at that time, a cohort of 10 senior women to Linkage's Women in Leadership Institute. And through that experience, they received very personalized and targeted leadership development. And then we empowered them, just kind of going back to the importance of what we were just talking about of listening, right? And we asked them, what do we need to do to make purposeful investments in our women to bring what we're doing for you, but to scale that across the organization. And we heard loud and clear a couple of things from this, inaugural cohort. One was establishing a women's focused ERG internally. And there was also an ask at that time to be a bit purposeful in saying that we are establishing an officer position accountable for diversity, equity, and inclusion at that time. So this group of women that we sort of tasked with helping us put our strategy together, they really helped shape the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion that we have today, and we're among the first established ERGs in our organization. Today, this ERG, it's called WISE internally. It has more than 600 members and 25 leadership positions across local and national chapters. And we're really excited to be launching WISE Mexico this month as well, which will expand our efforts there. And so I think, all that said, a key success factor for us really resulting in our partnership with Linkage and using this information and what our women are telling us was creating a consistent language for how we talk about developing and advancing women internally. And that framework and that language that we're using is really rooted in Susan McKenty Brady's book, Mastering Your Inner Critic, and Linkage's work with the 7 hurdles and the programs that we run internally, so that we're very clear about what we're talking about, why we're talking about it, and what we need to do differently. And so whether our women are engaging in that conversation through a formal women's focused development program, or we have someone engaging with our ERG as a woman or as an ally, that language is the same. And it's helped us create that consistency, build allyship, and I think create a tangibility to it that we can all get involved in and understand what and why we're talking about what we're doing. Lastly, I would say at Constellation over these, this number of years that we've also been very focused on is our commitment to not only advancing women within the walls of our organization, but within our industry and our communities as well. And that's an important part of our strategy. And a couple of the ways that we've done that is through our Women's ERG. Their philanthropic pillar has a formal partnership with Dress for Success International, where we're able to give back in a number of ways through that partnership. And we also made a significant commitment, $100 million over 10 years to female-founded and female-led organizations in our industry through Constellation Ventures. And just over the last couple of the years through that female founder initiative, we've been able to increase the mix of our female-led and female founder organizations from 20% to 50%. So it's really, we're quite proud of that. And so, I think it all comes together in what we're doing internally in our industry and in our community that's helped us see the numbers that you're sharing here today.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that story, Becky. And the reason I left the data up on the screen is because even though a lot of what you talked about in terms of the ERG group and sending a subset of your women to our Women in Leadership Institute and doing the development, a lot of efforts have been focused on development, but some of the other things you're talking about have, that has a halo effect on the culture. But what's interesting is every single lever has gone up year over year. And so what I'm wondering is, did you prioritize development and these became trickle effects, or were you equally prioritizing talent systems and things like executive action, which is what Ivy's going to talk about next?
Yeah, and so I would say yes to all. We were pretty purposeful in the strategy on the development side, and I think what's really important is making sure what we're doing from a development perspective is matching our talent systems, right, as well. So if we're putting this focus out there, we're asking women to invest their time, we're giving them, right, the resources and this development, we have to make sure that we have the infrastructure in place to help them advance and reach their goals, right? Otherwise, you have a lot of people waiting on the bench with nowhere right to go. So our development and our talent systems have really worked hand in hand through this time. And then I think, to use your words, Jennifer, that halo effect has been the integration of, as our women are graduating out of these programs, we're connecting them with the ERG. And I think that's where a lot of our listening, right, comes in, of what do we do next, right? And empowering them to take leadership and own this. So they're very inspired by what they're learning on the development side, and then they're able to action it within, the ERGs and what we're doing from like a Constellation Ventures perspective as well. So it truly is cultural and developmental, and that's on purpose.
Well, thank you for that. And so, Ivy, I'm going to turn it back to you. I know, looking at your data, what was surfacing was specific, the strategic evolution, perhaps related to talent systems as well as executive action. But I also know that Chubb has had a long history of investing and developing their women. So I don't want to pretend that that wasn't starting before, or it started only after you gathered this data. So why don't you tell us a little bit about history and then where you're going from here?
Yeah, I think one of the things that is interesting about this particular subject is investment into your talent systems and into your strategy is, while that may be something that you've kept up, it's also still tracking your outcomes to make sure that your level of investment does match your outcomes. But I think you're right, Jennifer. We've had a very long-standing commitment to gender issues. So we have a very active women's network. All our networks focus on three main veins. You have to focus on the business, you have to focus on talent, and you have to focus on the brand, right? So all the work that fueled group does for our organization has been very long-standing. In North America, we operate in about 43 different offices. So you can imagine the spread of that workforce, making sure people feel connected and have a sense of agency and voice at that local level. That's been ongoing for us. Honestly, Chubb does very well around learning and development opportunities. We invest very heavily in centralized learning, in very technical learning by business line, in personal effectiveness training. If you don't want to improve yourself, that's pretty much your choice. But if anybody wants to learn, the company has very well-oiled avenues for people to gain their learning and development. And for women, we actually have a junior women's program, we have mid-level career programs, and then we have these senior executive facing programs as well. And so that tells you, I think, that some of this stuff is while very relevant, still sometimes doesn't lead to the outcomes that you want. And actually, there are people who take the perspective that women are sometimes overdeveloped. And every time we talk about the advancement of women, we have to put women on training wheels versus really giving them the opportunity to grow and advance. So I think where I am right now, or where we are as an organization, is just recognizing the sustained efforts that we need to make around, our infrastructure. So what are we doing around our talent systems? One of the biggest changes we made, frankly, to our succession planning, Jennifer, was to make sure that all succession plannings had a very specific focus actually on gender diversity and racial diversity. And it sounds like a very small decision, but it's actually a very big decision, because that's where a lot of decisions are made as to who gets the next juicy assignment. So hardwiring your talent management systems to have the lens of DE&I think is also some of that continuum that we're on. There's a big call out for more sponsorship. So Jennifer, we launched sponsorship at Chubb in 2018. We started off with a pilot participation of about 16 women. Of the 16, 15 actually took on bigger roles. And I'm not talking adjacent business. These are significant role changes. And really what that is you're giving them the added support with somebody who has real influence at the executive table, and it's really making a difference. So one of our call outs from the leading indicators assessment is to really expand sponsorship. So even though we've started off with smaller numbers, I think in 2019 we increased the numbers, and 2020 we increased the numbers. But I think what this is said to us is maybe we should have a far bigger pool of women undertaking sponsorship, because bottom line, that's sometimes what people lack. When women get stuck in the managerial ranks, they really lack somebody more at the very senior level who has a line of sight to their contribution, who has a line of sight to how good they are, and who can actually make the case for them getting that next role. And then I think there's a whole call out around talent systems in terms of what are we doing to audit our talent systems to make sure that they have the right outcomes. Much of what Becky discussed is also something that we frankly care about in the Chubb organization. I'm looking at the metrics in two ways, Jennifer. So when I pull metrics, I do look at gender diversity in general, but I also like to look at client-facing women, because I think when you pull gender diversity, it will pull your statistics and give you a very healthy number until you actually do the distribution of women who own a P&L versus those who are non-P&L facing. And I think some of that, again, is just some of this extra work that we have to do on the back end to make sure that we're teasing out the metrics in a way that will really help govern the increasing of women who actually hold significant roles in the business.
So there's so many things going through my mind, and I don't want to lose them. So I'm going to park one of them. We have some questions coming in around talent systems, so I'm going to hold those for about 5 minutes. So thank you, Natasha. I will come back to you. I don't want to lose sight of two things. One is the role of men and sponsorship. So I'm going to go to that next. And then the second is your comment around women potentially being overdeveloped and maybe under-sponsored. So there's when Becky talks about the rise of women throughout the Constellation organization and the development of those women, what are the levels to help women get to a certain point? By the time they get to a certain point, how do you make sure you're surrounding them with sponsorship? And I know, Ivy, you told a story about the people that tend to be in the positions of power and influence across the world tend to be white men. How do you actually give them access, experience, knowledge, build deeper relationships so they can use their influence and their power at the appropriate time to make sure that they are aware of a much broader pool of women who potentially could take on those roles? So go ahead.
So Jennifer, I just wanted to tell the quick story where the light bulb came off in my own head. Like Becky, I sit at the talent management table. I am part of Chubb's succession planning process. So it's a really good laboratory to observe, right? And yes, like most financial services organizations, those rooms are predominantly white men. And I really noticed that when they were discussing men, they often had a very good idea of what the man was, what he did, what his skill set was, what his background was, what client relationships he had. The discussion was so rich. And then we would talk about Becky, and Becky, people would say, oh yeah, Becky, like what does she do again? There was always like, let's kind of recall what Becky does. Let's recall where she sits in the organization. There wasn't enough inventory around the woman. Now, this is not an intentional bias. This is one of those unintentional biases. More men know more men in our business. They don't know very much about the women in our business. So that whole space of sponsorship is about giving visibility, but frankly, line of sight. Who best can make an argument for your career than somebody who's actually sitting at the table who can say, you know what, let me tell you the 5 things that Becky can bring to this role and to this company. It really does fundamentally make a difference for people of color and women.
Yeah, and Becky, I'm going to turn to you to see if you have anything to add. But one of the things that we have become very aware of over the last 3 or 4 years is many organizations are putting sponsorship programs in place, but then potentially aren't able to sustain them because they don't have the right awareness, capability, or commitment on both sides. And by both sides, I mean not only the women in this case, the women leaders, but also the sponsors willing to say, I'm open and I'm ready, but I don't really know what it means. I don't know how to be a good sponsor. And so one of the things we're doing in our Women in Leadership Institute this year is opening a sponsorship track. We want executive men and executive women coming, experiencing the Women in Leadership Institute alongside their cohorts of women that are being invested in and developed, but have a very separate and special dedicated track on making them exceptional sponsors. So Becky, before we leave the topic of the critical role of men, do you have anything that you want to add?
Yeah, so we actually have some ROI internally on the importance of sponsorship, particularly related to our Women's Leadership Development Program. And we've been running that program for about 5 years now, where we're able to see sort of year over year, right, what's happening with these women, because executive sponsorship and visibility to our executive team is baked into that program and that experience that they have over the course of 8 to 10 months. And so since we started that program, it was an evolution of an existing program. So I just want to be clear, we didn't just start in 2017 developing our women, but that was our evolution and really the start of our relationship with Linkage. For women who joined in 2017 and beyond, and just to give it some scale, we're talking about putting our arms around 10 senior level women a year. So this is a very focused investment. But we've seen 80% retention of the women that have gone through that program, and 75% were promoted or took on significant new responsibilities within a year of their participation. So at Constellation and throughout our women's focused programming, we are trying to use that story as our sell sheet. There's a there, and how do we expand sponsorship in a more meaningful way across our programs and what we're doing, and embedding that into our talent systems as well. So there's certainly opportunity to continue to grow, but I'm thankful that we're able to show how that investment is working where we have done it over the last few years.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I'm going to start to shift us now into the Q&A. The first question is around talent systems. I'm going to let Becky and Ivy scroll through that for a minute while I just close my piece of this with a few slides. And then Edie's going to close us up in about 5 minutes or 5 or 10 minutes. So let me just go back. One of the things that we have been talking about is the power of investing in women. So investing in women as they rise in their career through leadership development, but also the role of the organization. And we've been talking about executive commitment in the form of sponsorship. I do want to give you a little bit more data, because again, we do track this year over year as we engage with women in development programs. And then this was really taken from the women who have been through our Women in Leadership Institute over the last 5 years. What's important here, regardless of whether it's formally through a linkage program or the programs you're running yourselves, is we have been able to measure ROI at the individual level and at the organizational level. So in this case, we're looking at the benefit at the individual level with women who have been invested in, feel like they are more able to define their unique strengths and talents. They are more confident. They are receiving pay increases, and they feel like they've been more often recognized. At the organizational level, the organization and the women will say that their team is outperforming the company average. They will say that they themselves are more engaged at work, they have more satisfaction, and they are more likely to stay. So again, you start to see these leading indicators that are that go up when women feel like they are being invested in. And investment can mean development, investment can mean sponsorship as well. I want to give you just 2 quick offers before we go to the Q&A. The one is related to what Becky has been talking about, our Women in Leadership Institute, which is now in a hybrid form. Thousands of women will join us in November, either in person or virtually. And then the executive sponsorship track that I mentioned a little bit earlier. We have been asked by our clients over the 22 years that we've been doing this to extend our programs beyond just the 4 days of the Leadership Institute into a more ongoing community. And so the Women in Leadership Accelerator is something that we have just launched that will include the Women in Leadership Institute. But the last thing I want to offer you is a complimentary webinar coming up in honor of International Women's Day. We would love for you to invite your women leaders to join us at no cost. If you want to go to linkageinc.com, the future of you, you will have access to 2 of our most senior leaders at Linkage, helping women leaders understand and reflect and create a plan for how they can overcome their own hurdles to advancement. And I'm going to stop sharing now so that we can spend our last 10 minutes on some of these questions. And thank you, Edie, for joining us again. So let's get back to the this idea of the talent systems. And this is a question, I'll throw it to Ivy and Becky, related to transparency, pay transparency specifically. And I think the specific question is transparency a strategy on how to bridge the pay gap, especially for women of color? And if that's not the answer, what is?
Yeah, look, yes, I do think transparency is critical to pay parity, but I think you have to think about pay parity in two ways, right? There's the negotiation that you have to undertake in your own company, because your pay scales are going to be inward facing. And when I'm coaching a senior woman, and when I'm coaching anyone, I'm saying, like, you have to keep an eye on the external market as well, because your skill set, your experiences, your background has value on the marketplace. So getting wise about the outside marketplace where you're competing, I think sometimes people focus only inwardly, and I think that's that sometimes is an error. But I think from a company perspective, we do look at regular auditing of our pay scales, regular auditing by role, like for like role. And actually, in some countries, we're required by law to publish gender gap reports. So the UKI, in France, these waves of litigation or legal requirements are shifting regardless of whether you want to be transparent or not. But I do think we owe that transparency to our colleagues internally. And I think I encourage people individually not only to look at a negotiation within your own company, but frankly, to keep an eye on your outside market as well. And really, there are very good tools right now to kind of get to pay transparency. You need to do a little bit of homework. You need to make sure you also have the skills to have the right level of negotiation.
And Edie, I actually want to turn it to you if that's okay, because I know it's an action initiative for WBC, specifically around pay parity. Is there anything that you would like to add around that?
Thank you very much. I think as you look at the pay parity, so much more attention, as we see with some of the laws and some of the progress. I think we can also say that women's soccer really propelled to give an image in the last 2 weeks of what it really means to get to pay parity, and that will transform. And good to use some of the other countries as examples. You, Ivy, talked about what are your systems and softwares that can do such a better job with that. And we're so pleased to be working with Cindy-O and others that are doing new kinds of tracking. And then what do we see is, on the other hand, of really personalizing plans for those that really want stretch assignments on a different subject, or those, because of childcare and others, want different assignments. And maybe we could ask all of you just to make comments on what you see of making sure those, as you sponsor, as you mentor, how do you do a better job of really supporting individual plans and interest?
Yeah, thank you, Edie. I see a question coming in through the chat, and there are a couple others related to how do we actually make more visible the I don't want to call it the burden, but the very well-researched documentation about the additional roles that women tend to be playing more than men related to family life, and anything outside of work, parent care, family care, house care. And then another comment, Natasha, connected to that was, are women, or it was an anonymous asking about, what about this additional work hours? Women are actually not applying for those roles because they can't imagine having to take on more. So maybe I'll turn to you, Becky. Is there anything, given that you've done a whole lot of work related to engaging and retaining your women, is there anything that you've got secret sauce that you can share with us?
A couple thoughts come to mind. Specific to Constellation, we've made a big commitment to what we call our flexibility program, internally, and not trying to say flexibility to one person is the same as flexible. Like, here's our flexibility program. If this works for you, right? Wonderful. But that flexibility means something different on a case-by-case basis, and trying to empower our leaders to lead their teams in the best way that works for the individuals, right? That work for them and meets our goals of what we're trying to achieve. So it's tough, I think on one hand, and as a leader of a team, of saying like, okay, I got to do this over here. I'm managing a lot of different, right, situations. But at the end of the day, we're all people, and all of our situations, right, are different. And so I think it's a two-way conversation. I think as leaders, we need to be asking the questions of, what do you need? What can I be doing different? How could the day look, different for you? What questions do you have? But then employees need to be willing to share that information, back, or offer it up if they're not being asked the question. I can share a quick, personal story with that. This was years ago when I was an HR business partner, a leader I was supporting. He started his day very, very early, and liked to kind of run through things with me first thing in the morning. And it was difficult because I had to wait for a school bus to pick up, my daughter. So I found myself, I was stressed every day trying to get her on the bus and get in, right, for my meeting. And I finally just said to him, I'm like, you're not getting the best of me, because I'm showing up stressed because I'm rushing here, right, to meet with you. I'm not as prepared, right, as I would like to be. Can we change? Can we do one of two things? Can we talk on the phone? So if we want to keep the time, I'm just not going to be at the office yet. Or can we adjust, right, the time of the meeting? And so I think we need to be willing to speak up and ask, and sort of, as you were saying at the beginning of the call, the great reimagination maybe of what does life look like a little bit different. And some of the things this pandemic has introduced of the day just looking different for folks, we need to be willing to ask, and we also need to empower our leaders to make those accommodations where they make sense.
Yeah, so I will close with the three of the hurdles that have surfaced as the most difficult for women to overcome, and that's been exacerbated during the pandemic. One is the one that you just mentioned, Becky, which is making the ask. And maybe it's not money or promotion, maybe it's flexibility or access to additional support. The second one is clarity. Do I know what I want my work life to look like in the context of the other demands for me? And the third one is proving our value. I mean, we as women do tend to over-row the boat, especially earlier in our career, in an effort to prove ourselves. How can we let go of that sooner and inspire others to help? Edie, I'm going to turn it over to you. I want to make sure the last 3 minutes you have an opportunity to close, but I want to thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you to Becky and Ivy for joining me.
To you at Linkage, and to Ivy, and clearly what we think is so strong, Becky, of your examples. And as we truly rethink and reimagine and readjust and make certain that we don't let us not become best companies for culture and talent, which the three of you presented, and the solutions, whether the sponsorship, the mentorship, the flexibility, and everyone feeling of value. And your data with Linkage has been so compelling, Jennifer, for all of us to stop and reflect. So a specific thank you to all three of you, to Becky and to Ivy, as we share best practices and push the envelope. And I think realize that it's not the top down anymore. We're listening to the bottom up and adjusting and changing to be so valued, so that those numbers change that you shared with Linkage. WBC is so proud to be running a Rethink conference where we want all of you to participate on May 11th before our summit on the 21st, 22nd. But clearly today you've helped us reimagine and rethink. So thank you for our learnings. What we're also seeing is that call for much more transparency in data, such as pay parity, but overall, so that we know that you want to be a best company that really has outstanding data and the new respect for women of color, LGBTQ, and all of the elements that make it a much richer culture. And as you share at Linkage and we share, those companies that do it well and are led with women have much stronger economic performance and retention. Thank
That's
you.
a good last word. Thank you, Edie. Happy Women's History Month.
Happy Women's History Month, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Abby. Thank you so much, Becky.
Thanks for having us. Thank you so much.